All right. Hi, Molly. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Victoria?
I'm doing well, thank you. I just wanted to start by saying welcome. We are so thrilled that you've joined us for our SAM event. We're going to be exploring pleasure activism and how it relates to your work and the work that you do with the folks that you work with. So before we get started, I wanted to introduce you to our community. And a couple of things I wanted to mention, which are super exciting, is that you have a long relationship with resilience, which folks will hear in your bio. And I'm super excited personally because when I was in grad school, I took your trauma-informed yoga training, even though I'm not a yoga teacher, and it was incredible. You're incredible. So I'm really excited. Yeah. So for folks that don't know, this is Molly Boeder Harris. She is the founder and executive director of the Breathe Network, a somatic experiencing practitioner and a trauma-informed yoga teacher and trainer. Her own experiences surviving sexual trauma catalyzed her to enter the trauma healing field in 2003, beginning with her own work as a medical and legal advocate with children and adult survivors, a campus violence prevention educator, and as a yoga teacher specializing in work with survivors. She earned her master's degree in international studies and her master's certificate in women's and gender studies, which inform the way she holds both individual and collective forms of trauma and oppression close together in her work. Over the last 2 decades of her career and healing trajectory, Molly has found that the practices which recognize the whole person, body, mind, and soul, and which also honor the ways in which trauma and resilience manifest physiologically, offer the greatest possibility for embodied justice and social change. How did I do?
You did great. I could have sent you something a little bit shorter. So
Oh
thanks for
no,
reading all of that.
no, it's perfect. So yeah, welcome. I'm so excited. Did you want to say anything to our community, or if you want to like share maybe your Instagram handle? Um,
Yeah, I just wanted just to go back to that earlier comment you shared that I have
mhm.
a history with resilience, just to give context to how I'm connected.
Yes.
I started as a client at Resilience in 2003 when it was called Rape Victim Advocates. So I think it's helpful to have that context, especially if you are listening today and you're really in like the throes of feeling some of the extreme challenges of how sexual trauma is impacting you, your body, your relationships, your life, whether it's recent or decades ago. Sometimes it's nice to hear about the different trajectories we might take in the work. So I was a client at RVA/Resilience. And then I began as a volunteer medical and legal advocate for some time. And I met some of my best friends through that training. And some of the staff who were there, I've stayed connected with, who kind of supervised me and supported me. And then I went on to work professionally as an advocate at the Quetzal Center. And then later I was the children's bilingual advocate at the Rise Children's Center with what is now known as Resilience. So I've been connected to you all for quite some time. And it's really cool to be here in this like new kind of conversation today. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you for the years of dedication to survivors. And I think that's an awesome highlight to say that, our paths completely change and can change wherever we are and wherever that is. So thank you for sharing that.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So I wanted to ask you some questions today. And I really like this first one. Is there a quote or a phrase that gives you strength that you would like to share with our community?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question in advance, and I
Mhm.
was kind of like looking for what's the right quote to share given the context of the conversation. And then it was really interesting because I was doing my yoga practice before this call today, and as a way to kind of like ground myself a little bit with some of the nerves of an interview. And I had what I sometimes call like one of those embodied epiphanies while I'm practicing, where something just comes through really clear. And I heard this quote that I often share in trainings and just tell myself, which is, I don't work with trauma, I work with resilience. And that is a quote that one of my teachers, Dr. Peter Levine, who created the somatic experiencing trauma resolution method, had said in a training. And it just really struck me, especially as somebody who is doing the work as a survivor. And we know that, if we are a trauma survivor and we're working with trauma survivors, there's just going to be these moments where our experiences start to overlap sometimes with the folks that we serve, or it's hard to distinguish or separate like what is the impact of the work versus what is just like organically coming up in my own trauma healing journey. And so I think it's important to find like some kind of anchor or compass for folks who are doing this work. And for me, it is that resilience piece. It's like when I come to do the work with folks, when resilience is at the center of it, I come to it with a lot more trust in a person's capacity to move through something. I also am really thinking about how our bodies have physiologically responded to trauma as resilience responses versus trauma responses alone, because those different responses that we move through, whether it's sort of the larger categories of fight, flight, and freeze, or the more like subtle, specific to us ways of coping or adapting or behaving after trauma, those changes or responses are all part of how it is that we keep getting through, how we get through like the acute experience of trauma and how we continue to get through every day. So I find it really fascinating to see those like really big systemic survival responses as part of resilience, not separate from, not something that we need to get over, but we need to really figure out like what was that response that wanted to happen and how can I actually honor it and complete it and move through it and let it do what it wanted to do to protect me and to continue to help me feel safer.
I love that quote so much. I think it's so important. I think a lot of my clients often share that too, like, why did I respond in this way? I should have done this other thing. And I like the protective like part that you just mentioned too. It's like your body wants to keep you safe,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll do what it needs to do in that moment. I like that quote a lot. So my next question is, sympathetic activation of the nervous system during pleasurable experiences can often resemble the felt sense experience of hyperarousal trauma fear states. What can support survivors to differentiate these different states? What have you found personally and professionally with your community?
Yeah. So, of course, there's no like one thing that's going to work for every person.
Sure.
And, I think that the more we can connect with some degree of like physio education, where we are learning about how our own nervous system responded to trauma, sexual trauma specifically, because that's kind of what we're sort of focusing on here today. How did our bodies respond in that moment? How have they continued to respond? How are we finding those like responses showing up in our day-to-day lives or in these more intense moments, like you said, pleasure or any kind of like nervous system sympathetic activation? So I think that's like one of the first steps is really just getting to know like the language of your own body or the language of your own physiology, and really starting to have a degree of appreciation for it and like why it does the things that it do, how those things are helping you to cope and endure. um, I think it's helpful to be doing that work at times with another person. So like there's so many books available right now that talk about sort of the physiology of trauma responses. And so One of the ones that I love so much is a book by Babette Rothschild, who you're probably familiar with, a somatic psychotherapist, called Eight Keys to Safe Trauma Recovery. And it's really oriented around um, appreciating and appropriating your own somatic responses to trauma and like gently beginning to work with them to get more comfort within your own shape and more clarity, more really cultivate like your own map for how you work with your own states of activation and settling. Um, and it can be helpful to start to, as one of my teachers says, like do some practice laps with higher states of activation in the container, like a therapeutic container with somebody. So whether it's a trauma trained body worker or it's a psychotherapist who has training in trauma, letting yourself within like a safer supported container start to feel into some of those states of higher activation and start to really build like a sense of capacity in your own body that you can actually tolerate some of those more charged states, I think can be helpful prior to or alongside just living life where we're going to naturally experience these things. Um, as a somatic experiencing practitioner myself, I'm really trained to see trauma not as like solely the event, but really like what happened in the nervous system, what did the body really want to do, and what was it prevented from doing in service of survival. What did the body want to do? And first responders came in and kind of quelled or shut down or overrode a response we might have needed to have in that moment. So, how can we create a space for the body to actually fully express what it needed to do? And what's really beautiful about our bodies is we often talk about in the trauma field, like the body keeps the score, the body remembers. And when we hear that language as survivors or even, people working in the healing field, we often first think of all the like dark, heavy, horrific breaches that have been so painful that the body remembers. But the body remembers goodness and ease and joy and safety and pleasure. So we can start to get to know, what does it feel? How does our body feel in those spaces as well? Like we want to create the conditions where we can start to pay attention to, what does pleasure feel like in my body, which is different for every person. What does anxiety feel like in my body? What happens when I start to think about pleasure, when I start to think about intimacy, when I start to think about um, ecstasy, some of these like larger experiences, even sometimes just like anticipating them, thinking about them, will create its own cycle of like nervous system activation. So you can like get these little experiences, again, these like practice laps where you get a handle on like, whoa, that was kind of intense to just imagine what it would be like to be intimate with a new partner after sexual trauma. And like I was able to successfully move through that with my therapist. And now we're going to go into like the next wave. And I'm just going to continue to build like a bigger container so that I can hold those states of activation and also trust, gain trust that my nervous system has the capacity to move and oscillate through states of like high activation and sympathetic charge back into places of more parasympathetic connection and co-regulation. I don't know if that's helpful.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think what you mentioned about, finding somebody to do that with, instead of feeling like you have to do it on your own, like the importance of community. And I love the metaphor of the container. Um, yeah, I'm curious about if any of your clients have ever, how they express safety in a session with you. Are there certain like breathing techniques or something else you'd like to share with folks, like something like just to start with, to kind of start to find some sort of starting point,
Yeah, like
are
something
feeling
more.
anxious.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so part of the like somatic experiencing way of working with folks is understanding that if we have a history of trauma, we're going to have potentially, not always, but potentially a tendency towards more vigilance than somebody who doesn't have a history of trauma. And so, again, that's like a way in which our brain is working to protect us. But after trauma, sometimes our brain and the parts of the brain that are more associated with those, that sort of like protective tracking and vigilance, tend to be like a bodyguard that never takes a day off, and they're operating at all times. So we need to do things to let the bodyguard know, like, hey, it's okay. I'm in a safe enough environment for you to like go take lunch. So, but in order to do that, like we have to give our body actually like signals at a nervous system level that it's okay for the bodyguard part of our brain to rest. And so what we find, and what I do in my work, is that prior to like going inward with a person and like doing intimate work and inviting them to like track themselves and to sense inside the way we might even think we would do in like contemplative practices like yoga or meditation, is to actually give them a chance to locate themselves within their surrounding environment. So to kind of quell that like vigilance, that need to know, are we safe, or to what degree am I safe right now? And so I will invite people at the beginning of any session, whether it's somatic experiencing or yoga, to take a moment to actually use their sense organs to take in some of the features of their environment. So that might mean using eyes to actually like pause and look around and check out what's behind them, look up, look down. It might mean just moving their body in some way that helps them kind of feel like what's beneath them, what is maybe keeping them cozy right now. Like I have a blanket. It might be yeah, crystals. I have a rock quartz. I have a rose quartz here as well.
I do too.
And or like maybe sound is something that's really helpful for settling them. So like we can use any of the sense organs. And so I try to keep it open-ended because people have different sense organs that are available or not available, or some that are just maybe more helpful. And so after they've spent a little bit of time doing that, and then their system gets a sense that I'm safe enough right now, I kind of like where I am, I know where the door is. I might also kind of notice like, oh, it's a beautiful day outside, or the rain is feeling really soothing. Then I might ask them to just notice what's happening in their body. And I can usually see postural changes. I'm looking for what might be happening in the musculature of their face or in their throat. I'm noticing their breathing. I might notice that after somebody did that kind of orientation, that they kind of like settle a little bit back into their chair. And so I'm kind of looking for some of the cues from their physiology that are telling me like, okay, I'm feeling a little bit safer here, which in some ways is just like I'm feeling more here, and I don't have to have my attention outside because I trust that my external environment's okay, and now I can really connect with you. So that orientation process, I think, is really important for any work we do with people, whether we're a therapist or a yoga teacher or a nurse practitioner. You know, coming into a new environment is going to be activating in and of itself. So that just gives us like time to land, and also transitions are so important. So there could be like a buildup of energy and anticipation of a meeting, and those first like 1 or 2 or 3 minutes allows a person to start to like breathe. So there's one other thing. This movement, there was a study done, this movement of turning the head side to side. So if a person has that ability to move their neck and head, was shown to kind of catalyze or create a parasympathetic nervous system response. So to kind of offer some degree of toning or stimulation to the vagus nerve and the part of it that has to do with settling, slowing down, really landing. So that can, in and of itself, be really helpful to people. And then, of course, if sight is available, just seeing like what's around you can be really orienting.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know myself and I know other trauma therapists or anybody working or any clients of ours, sometimes it's hard to know where to start.
Mhm.
And that was just lovely, just describing to be here now.
Mhm.
And I enjoyed seeing what you're holding and what's in front of you. I've got my crystals all laid out. So that's always sometimes really nice since we're virtual.
It is. I also have a stuffed animal, a
Yeah.
fox, which is my child's
Oh,
animal. But there's actually animals all over the floor that you can't see and other toys. And I was like, oh, this is resourcing to me, like this cozy, soft, sweet little animal that brings so much joy to my little person. So
I love that. Okay, so on to our next question, if you're ready.
mhm.
It was, could you speak to how the dynamic between pain and pleasure shows up for you in your pleasure activism?
The dynamic between pain and pleasure in my pleasure activism. It's funny because I kind of thought about it for a while. And then when I'm asked the question, it feels like such a big question. So um, I think that I want to start by saying that shame in and of itself is really, really significant for any survivor of sexual trauma. Um, I never want to assume that there's some universal experience ever. And yet, I have really yet to work with a survivor that doesn't have to navigate at some point in their healing how shame is showing up in relationships with other people, in relationship to their own body. And so I think it's important to just state that like shame is really real for us. And for me, this is my own personal sort of way of thinking about it. I think about how we know that the freeze response is very, very common for survivors of sexual trauma. There's a study that was done that's mentioned in one of Peter Levine's books, In an Unspoken Voice, that found over 80% of child sexual abuse survivors and at least 75% of adult sexual assault survivors reported um, pretty high degrees of immobilization and paralysis and not feeling their bodies. And there's a thought that it's probably much higher, but because of dissociation, people are not even necessarily tracking their own physical experience. So there's this presence of the physiological experience of freeze, which I think that in and of itself lends itself to a sort of somatic kind of shame in the aftermath of sexual trauma, because the embodied experience of being helpless to defend yourself, to interrupt what's happening, to stop it, to speak out against it, um, creates some kind of not conscious, in my view, like an unconscious sense of culpability, even though we know, right? And nobody on this call hopefully needs to hear me say this for the first time. Hopefully you've heard it 1,000 times, that there's nothing we could have done to stop sexual trauma from being done to us. Like that was the choice of the person or persons who harmed us, and everything we did was in service of survival. Freeze increases your chances of survivability. So it's a really wise self-defense and self-protective mechanism.
Mhm.
But still to be in that place of like absolute helplessness can just create this sort of like somatic sense of shame. And I think that that starts to show up in the ways that survivors do their best to cope. We see a lot of these like somatic shame based coping mechanisms, whether it's um, eating disorders, whether it's self harm, whether it's disfigured views of our own body or personhood, where we start to conflate like, my body feels bad, therefore I am bad, which can be more pronounced for child sexual abuse survivors. Um, We see studies that show overwashing, so like a lot of bathing that is more than is really required for hygiene, for survivors to kind of deal with this sense of like dirtiness that they just want to like get off their body. And then comes in culture, which in and of itself shames survivors and tells survivors they're complicit somehow. We grow up with a message to do everything we can to avoid this thing from happening. And so when it does happen to us, and it happens to so many of us, there is this also sense of culpability of like, I didn't do enough to stop it. So I feel like the cultural messaging of shame comes in and like really like on top of that physiological experience, and it makes it really hard. So I just feel like I can't speak about shame without mentioning those pieces. And when it comes to like how shame can interrupt pleasure, one of the things that's important to remember is like my body is trying to send me like some sort of my body's trying to deliver me some kind of resource now to feel safer. So if it's interrupting the experience of pleasure right now, like I'm getting hijacked by memories or anxiousness, or I got to get out of this situation, or I'm running out of this yoga class, or I'm jumping out of this bed that was feeling really good a minute ago, like there's something in your nervous system that's just like, this is not right. And that's happening at a nervous system level. That's not a conscious choice. It's like a systemic decision that has everything to do with this is too much. And trauma in and of itself is too much, too fast, or too soon. And so we want to really approach ourselves with like a lot of self-compassion, and maybe we pull back and then we like reflect on the situation. What was overwhelming in that moment? Maybe it was just 1 degree further than we needed to go with that pleasure practice. And so maybe we pull back and we do a little bit less next time, or maybe we bring in some different kinds of resources or ways of communicating or supporting ourselves or changing the environment in some way so that we can experience that pleasure again. But often, pleasure is a really big experience. Sometimes pleasurable experiences can give us almost an out of body experience, and it can look a lot like the out of body experience of trauma. So of course they're going to often be coupled together for people. And so kind of uncoupling those experiences can become its own practice. And I want to give an example of that because this is something I'm working on right now, like 18 years later. So I'm really playing with stillness in my meditation practice as a pleasurable experience of like kind of not feeling my body. Like, how can I use the stillness I access and the sort of like tingling and almost not feeling my body in meditation as a way to begin to get more comfortable with that state of being? Because for me, for so long, it would get really coupled with like when I can't feel my body, I feel a loss of control, and then I feel really fearful and I need to like brace everything, and I need to speak and I need to move because I need to feel like I'm here in this space because I've left before for trauma to survive it, and that was really disturbing. So so that could be like for somebody, like for me, it's like incremental. It's like 1 minute at a time. Like I always notice the moment when I can't feel my body anymore, and I'm like, oh, here we are, we're starting to not feel my body. Okay, I'm aware of that, and so like my meditation, I'm pretty there. Like it's very much like the observer part of me is online and noticing like, okay, there's tingling. I can't feel my hands. Now I can't really feel much of my body. And sometimes when that happens, I might like move my neck and shoulders and just remember like, okay, I'm still here in my body, and then settle back in. And that's been like this really cool way for me to start to appreciate that there could be something really beautiful and liberating and powerful in those really extraordinary states of big activation. Is that helpful at all?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I know myself, I'm going to speak for myself. I often encourage my clients to meditate and
Mhm.
to you know, be still. But that was such a helpful way of thinking about the stillness. And when the activation comes, like a gentle, like back and forth is what I was visualizing while you were saying that.
Mhm.
I really love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, okay, so next question is how can we hold space for shame when it joins us in our pleasure practices, in particular when it blocks us from receiving pleasure? Um, I know you kind of touched base on this, but if there's anything you want to expand.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is just really like not admonishing yourself if there is a resistance or even a reluctance to the idea of pleasure. Again, whether it's been 6 months since you've survived sexual trauma or 16 years. Um, I think that our culture communicates that message of like needing to get over it, needing to be better. And then, of course, we ourselves as survivors we really want to get over it or to get through the hardest parts of it. And we want to be able to access what we perceive other people accessing with a lot of ease. And so I just want to like normalize that. I remember like in the early 2000s, and I don't know how it looks right now, like there was so much energy around sex positivity and everything was sex positivity. Everything with Sam was sex positivity. Everything with the rape crisis movement was sex positivity. And I was like, we were kind of like jumping ahead, and not that these things can't happen simultaneously, and they should and they can, but I remember like I was still in the really acute parts of like there's not a whole lot about sex and positivity aren't yet together for me. Like it's still really strained and complicated. And so even just seeing that language to me, I would feel like an aversion, and then I would feel shame. I'd be like, oh, I'm bad at this and what's wrong with me? And then I'd feel like shame about my own sexuality, and I would just go down this rabbit hole that's so ridiculous and was not the intention of the work, of course, but that's how it landed for me. So I just really want to name that, like, when you see the word pleasure or you think about pleasure, if it feels if you feel averse to it or it feels too overwhelming, then maybe there's a different word for you right now where it's like, it's not pleasure activism or pleasure in general. It's like, where is their ease? Where is their comfort? Where is their joy? Where is their rest? And all of those, where's their connection? Like all of those are gateways and doors to pleasure. But that word can be, I think, loaded because a lot of times you might even have pleasure and sexuality really coupled. And so if you're a sexual trauma survivor and you're still kind of really in the throes of the healing, there might be some wisdom around wanting to keep that at bay. Maybe that like your system isn't really ready for that. So maybe again like ease and goodness and comfort or how you start. And like I can see in the screen behind me that I have these yellow daffodils, and so it's like spending time with flowers. It sounds so ridiculous, but like for me, I have all of these daffodils growing in my backyard, and I never even noticed daffodils until I lived somewhere where they were everywhere. And it's like, like savoring daffodils and the color and the scent and the feeling of being around them and belonging to them. It's like finding the things that are uniquely healing or good or enlivening even for you, and then starting to like really lean into them and savor them. And we know that for trauma survivors, it's not unexpected that our attention is going to be more in the direction of figuring out what's threatening, what's not right about our environment, what's not right in our body. And so really practicing just savoring like 1 minute of goodness or ease at a time, again, as a gateway to returning to tapping into states of, pleasure or bigger positive experiences.
I love that reframe of make pleasure activism whatever it is that you need. I do think folks often, a lot of my clients at least, will associate with it with like sexuality or a sexual act. So I appreciate you just sharing that bit of like, what does pleasure mean to you today? And it can change.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
I loved that you mentioned your plants. Back when I was in the office with my coworkers, we would like go and water our plants between clients. It's something
Mhm.
so lovely to take care of something after a session, and it takes care of you back. Um,
Mhm.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, okay, so we got a few more minutes. I love this question. It is, how do you work to reclaim your whole, happy, and satisfied self against depression?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful question. Um, I think first and foremost is really starting with the recognition that I'm already inherently whole.
Mm.
Um, you know, Happy and satisfied can come, but I think like just really recognizing like there's nothing that has happened around me or to me or in my history that could anyway like make me less whole. And I think that that's not something I am like cognitively thinking about on a daily basis, but I think there's all of these different practices and ways of healing that have come together to kind of create that as like um, a foundation. And sometimes I have to look around for that. Can I forget it, quite often? But even just hearing that question, it's like, and I think it's important for survivors who get a message of like brokenness or feel brokenness or feel like they're all of these disparate parts because they've had to disconnect or dissociate or fragment themselves in order to live through sexual trauma and other forms of systemic trauma, whether it's racism or heterosexism or ableism, that they've had to compartmentalize all of these parts of themselves. So I think any sort of practice that allows us to consistently, even if just in like micro moments, connect with like, I am fully whole, even if it's just saying that to ourselves is really important. For me, it's been a lot of feeling empowered to write my own map about what it means to me to heal as a survivor of sexual trauma, um, to have looked around and not seen like where I fit in, or how, or to judge myself against what other survivors' experiences have been, has just contributed to feelings of like I'm not doing it right, or there's something in me that's still broken or unfixable. And it's like once I set that aside and decided like I'm not going to compare my experience to other people's because that's impossible. And we only get small slices of each other's lives anyway. Like 99% of it, like none of us even see, like the really what's happening in our inner world. So I feel like that's been part of finding my own sense of happiness and joy and satisfaction is realizing like I get to write my own map for how I do this. And I get to pick and choose what parts of um, what parts of like the messaging or the pathway or the resources and tools feel right to me. Of course, having like a consistent practice of healing, and really attending to my healing really on a daily basis, whether that's through like a somatic practice of like meditation or yoga or some kind of movement, connecting with nature, connecting with play and joy and silliness and nature through spending time with my child. Having boundaries around my work has been really important. I think as survivors, we feel compelled to know everything that's going on in the world that relates to sexual trauma. It's again like that's part of how our brain is like keeping us safe. Like we need to know like what's going on outside, whether it's outside our neighborhood or in the next city over or across the ocean, because it affects
Private
us.
sector.
We're all affected by everything. And so at the same time, it's so overwhelming. And so I think it's important. It's been important for me to know that it's okay to not know everything. It's okay to just have like the headline on a story and not know every detail. Especially if it's starting to like show up in my own body and it's starting to be really dysregulating to me. Staying in relationship with other survivors who allow for like our humanness and our ongoing healing to still be unfolding, to be part of the conversation, like other survivors who can talk about like, this is still really hard for me, and I just want to cry, or I have been sleeping terrible for the last 6 months, whatever it is, like places where there's no judgment. Um, Having hobbies and dreams that have nothing to do with the movement to end sexual violence is really important to me. Like
I love
seeing
that.
how I show up in the world totally separate from that role as a survivor and as an activist in the movement. And then also just feeling, how can I be part of, like how do you reclaim your wholeness in the face of oppression? For me, it's also like, how do I f- feel myself as part of a wider web of people and movements that are organizing to dismantle many, many different overlapping or interlocking systems of oppression. Like that's where I find happiness and satisfaction too, is like finding my way into other movements as an ally, as a supporter, as a resource. So feeling part of just humanity has been really important, because I think it's these systemic oppression and capitalism and histories of trauma just really like chip away at our sense of humanity, from the experience of trauma itself that is so dehumanizing, to then the ongoing experiences and ancestral experiences, and again like social experiences that just tend to dehumanize us. So anything that allows me to feel connected to other people in a way that allows me to be fully human is really helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think
Mhm.
a lot of folks, and myself included, we sometimes want to say that we're done, or, and it's just so gentle to always be reminded that we're whole and that the healing process is ongoing. Thanks for sharing your buckets that you fill in your life, like other
Mhm.
than the job that you have,
Mhm.
doing this work.
Mhm.
Um, so my next question is, who awakens your senses? Who are your teachers?
Mhm. Um, I would say right now, my primary teacher is my 3-year-old. So,
So
um, yeah, it's just, from the experience of being pregnant, that sensory awakening that she introduced has been really, really significant and extraordinary, complicated at times, like I've had a lot of senses awakened that I didn't necessarily want to awaken, and she's brought them to the surface. Um, but it's been a pretty profound experience for me to be with someone who is fully present. Like that's language we use a lot when we talk about healing and safety, is like, being present, surrendering to what is, finding stability in the moment. Um, but it's easier said than done when you are an adult and you have a history of things that really pull at your attention. So um, being around her has allowed me to really drop into my presence in a way that few things have. Like I can tap into that in the middle of a yoga practice or through meditation, through nature, like going deep into a forest or a park, or, I'm from Chicago, so like spending time just like being with the lake. Um, but like with my child, it can be really quick and it's really direct. And then also witnessing her behavioral flexibility, that a flexibility that I don't have anymore, that I really like. She's a real teacher of that, of like she can go into these really intense states of anger and sadness, and come back out into joy and ease and like peacefulness, really, with a lot of ease. And so I see with her like a nervous system that's just like oscillating so beautifully and easefully. And that actually is very co-regulating to me. We talk about like how parents co-regulate, can, be co-regulatory forces for their children, positive co-regulators. And therapists can be that as well. But it's been really powerful for me to see that I actually receive that from my 3-year-old, who wants to touch me, hold me, to be held by me, to sing with me, to, just like I listen to her voice and I'm like, oh, like the sound of her voice is so soothing, like the way it's so sing-songy and gentle and then really strong. So I had a teacher once say, children are not overly committed to their sorrow. And like just we were talking about like sadness and grief and just how they can really move, like, and that's something we all have the capacity to move that way, but we've been conditioned out of that, or we just haven't been safe enough to do that. So I get to practice that with her, like, because she needs me to actually move out of like those, I need to be more flexible in my nervous system states in order to show up as a safe, present parent for her. So I can get really overwhelmed and I can freak out and I can lose my temper, but I have to really quickly like regulate and ground and do repair with her. So she's given me a lot of practice at, like connecting to my body, connecting to my environment, like savoring, like, oh my gosh, a cupcake is the most wonderful thing on the planet if you're 3. And I can appreciate that with her. So, yeah. And just like the power of our bodies, and like, she's so in her body, so I'm like, whoa, I want to dance with you. I want to move the way that you move. It's so fluid. So she is like my teacher and my sensory guide and mirror in so many ways.
That was a beautiful response, Molly. Thank you so much for
You're
sharing
welcome.
that.
You're welcome.
And our next question and our last question is, who taught you to feel good? What does feeling good mean to you and the folks you work with? Is there a practice you utilize to tap into that goodness?
Yeah. Who taught me to feel good? It's interesting, because when I think about that, I don't think that I had, um, up until I was really diving in to do trauma specific healing work, I
Mhm.
don't think I really had any clearly identifiable teachers that were like helping me understand what goodness felt like in my body. I think that I kind of naturally sought that out through nature. That was really like a primary resource. So the who is like the she that is our ecosystem, perhaps, for our earth. Um, and so I think like that was a place where I would feel goodness and connect with goodness, I think, through nature. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on that question because I was able to learn like what goodness felt like in my own body by doing really somatic oriented trauma healing work. Like I think if we're a trauma survivor, and especially if we have really early trauma, um, we can get some message that like, well, all these things were not laid down at this very important time in your neurological development. So now like there's this idea that we're broken or we're missing these pieces. And what I find, and I saw this in parenting as well, is there was a lot of things that weren't laid down for me very early on. And it was like in my 20s and 30s and 40s that I started to really access them. And like I was so ready to receive um, care and touch and love, like when I was, just on the other side of what I consider sort of my most intense experience with sexual trauma. And so that to me is like I think like a real testament to the like human capacity for resilience, that like even though I hadn't received touch, very much touch or co-regulation as a child, that as an adult, when I most needed that as a way to start to heal and reclaim my body, that I was like so receptive to body workers and yoga teachers and my trauma therapist and my boyfriend, who eventually became my life partner, that like I was ready for it, you know, as ready as I was to like do the trauma healing work at a nervous system level, I was also ready to receive healing and care. And so I really am grateful for all of my trauma healers who taught me about feeling goodness, and my partner who helped me navigate that, like one tiny, tiny act of intimacy at a time, you know, that just began with language. And then it was like, you know, we were like adults navigating intimacy where there was this very recent history of sexual assault and rape, and navigating it like some people might expect, like teenagers first navigating intimacy. And it was really amazing to be able to have that return to intimacy and pleasure and sexuality be so slow. It really worked for me. And then, of course, like my child teaches me and helps me feel good and just feel like laughter. Like there's so much laughter and there's so much joy and there's so much play. And those laughter and joy and play were sort of underrepresented in my work and my life because of my work, you know. And so I've really tried to make more space for that. And my somatic experiencing practice really supports the savoring and overly attending to like what feels good and what feels easy and comfortable in my body. And then occasionally dipping into like, where is there tension and pain and suffering? But let's now come back so that the foundation of my like sort of overall experience is one of like, there's a baseline of goodness here that allows me to know I can dip into those other harder states and return.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's so nice to hear that, you know, folks often want to hear it's never too late to repair
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
And it sounds like, yeah, you have so many people around you that were and still are on this journey with you. Um,
Mhm.
thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thank you so much for having me
You're
here as
so
part
welcome.
of this series. I've really come full circle with resilience. So thanks so much.
You really have. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we finish up, or?
No, I think if folks need to reach out to me, you know, you can go to the Breathe Network's website and contact me through our email, and I'll be the person on the other side of that. Info at the Breathe Network or Molly at the Breathe Network.
Amazing. We'll have all your contact information at the bottom of this post as well.
Okay.
All right, Molly, thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for taking the time and energy to come and speak with me so we can share this with our community. Um, yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Bye.